Okay, what we're going to do today is going to talk about the biogeochemical cycles. And I'd like you to realize that if you go into Google Classroom and look for the material that is associated with this video, that you'll find the Google Slides for this discussion. And then you'll also see I've attached a PDF. And you can print that off at home if you find it'll help you. It's a blank version of all of the cycles that I'm going to go over right now. So you can like write in the words and get a better sense of what it is that's going on if that helps you. All right, I'll take a break for a minute here and let you pause it here and go do that now if you want to. Okay, welcome back. We are going to talk about the biogeochemical cycles and what that involves is taking a look at most of life and looking at how it thrives on Earth. And it thrives on Earth because of these cycles that we see that happens. Now let's talk about what these cycles are. So a biogeochemical cycle is basically bio, which means living, geo, which means earth, and chemical, which means physical substance. So when we put all of these things together, what we're looking at is a biogeochemical cycle that recycles the elements between living and non-living reservoirs. Now, a reservoir is like a body of something. So if you have a forest, that forest can be a reservoir for a bunch of different things. So living, earth, cycle together in the form of physical substances. All right, let's talk about what some of those substances can be. So these substances can be water, carbon, and nitrogen. So you, I'm hoping, are already really familiar with the water cycle. You might be somewhat familiar with the carbon cycle and even less familiar with the nitrogen cycle. So let's go ahead and take a look at these cycles and refresh your memory or introduce you to some new concepts. Okay, so remember that a biogeochemical cycle is taking the living and non-living things and bringing them between each other. So it's basically a recycling system. So we're looking at how each of these chemicals, water, carbon, and nitrogen, are transferred between living and non-living reservoirs or groups, areas of things. So a reservoir is like a holding tank. Lexington Reservoir, if you've driven over to Santa Cruz, you pass that big body of water that is known as Lexington Reservoir. And this is basically a holding tank for water. There are lots of different reservoirs or holding tanks. Plants, the forest, the atmosphere, the dirt, all of these things can be reservoirs. Remember, though, that all the nutrients we have on Earth, or that we are all we ever will have, right? So all of the carbon that exists on Earth exists in some form in a reservoir. All of the water that we have on Earth exists in some form in a reservoir. Okay, so we don't lose them, we don't gain more, we just recycle them. So let's take a look at one of these reservoirs. We're going to call it the water cycle. And this is one of those pictures that if earlier you printed out something, you should have this picture or something very similar to it on the printout that I attached in Google Classroom. And so if we look at this, we've got the sky up here and the sun, and we know that the air is moving. That's what transport means. So it's moving from the left side of the paper to the right side of the paper. And we see these big white arrows representing where the water and whatever form it's going to be in is moving in this cycle. So let's take a look at the first word. The first word we have is precipitation, and I know that you are all very familiar with that. We've recently had some precipitation this weekend. Precipitation is basically water changing from a really cool liquid to a warmer liquid and then falling out of the sky. The next one is called runoff. And so basically this water will stream down off of the earth or the surface of the earth and move into streams, gutters, lakes, oceans. It travels on the surface. The next kind of water movement is something that's called seepage. And this basically is water moving into the soil and going into a reservoir that's actually a body of water in the dirt. It's called groundwater. And so what happens is this water will seep into the groundwater and the roots will take that up. So the history of Silicon Valley originated in growing things. We grew a whole bunch of stuff in our valley that we live in, and that's because we had a lot of groundwater that roots could be planted into and take advantage of and grow. Well, as we grew more and more plants, and as we started having more and more people taking from that groundwater, the groundwater actually fell. The level of water in the ground fell and actually started to disappear. And so that causes certain things that we call a sinkhole, when suddenly all the space in the dirt is now full of air and something heavy on top of it will push it down and you get a sinkhole. All right, so after the water sits in the big lake, river, stream, ocean, the sun is responsible for taking that water and turning it into vapor, right? Heating the water and turning it into a gas, and it will then move into the atmosphere. Well, water can also evaporate from plants. And so that type of evaporation from a plant is called transpiration. And transpiration is when water evaporates from a plant. If you were to go and take a cooking bag, these are basically bags that are used to cook meat in it. If you were to take that and seal it around a branch with a bunch of leaves inside, over a 24-hour period, you could collect water in that bag. And that is coming from the water leaving the openings in the leaves and condensing on the inside of the bag. And that's called transpiration. So transpiration is probably one of the newer terms that you're learning in the water cycle. There's a link here that you can click on later if you'd like. It takes you to the United States Geological Survey, USGS, United States Geological Survey. And it's basically a diagram similar to what I just showed you, but when you hover over words, it'll give you different examples and more external links to go and take you to explore more of the water cycle. Okay, next cycle. So the next cycle is the carbon cycle. The carbon cycle is basically driven by the energy that we give in ourselves and in plants, and then as well as what we burn. So when looking at this, photosynthesis takes the carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and puts it into sugar. That sugar is then consumed by something called a primary consumer. This primary consumer is something that is considered a vegetarian, right? All it does is eat vegetable matter. That energy that the consumer is getting, either whether they're a high level consumer like the bobcat or the primary consumer like the rabbit, all of those things are doing something that eventually leads to death or decay, whether it's the plant, the primary consumer, or the higher level consumers. They will all eventually die and decay, and that puts them back into the earth as a form of carbon. But when they're alive, what they actually do is something called respiration. We learned about this. This is what the mitochondria does. It takes sugar, produces energy for us to survive, and then the carbon dioxide is given off through breathing. It transfers from the cell into the blood, into the lungs, and then out into the air. The other way that carbon is taken and put into the atmosphere is through combustion. And this is what happens when things burn. So you can take trees, you can take coal, fossil fuels, leaf litter. There's a lot of different things that are found here in the earth that can be used in the form of combustion. And this combustion leads to putting even more carbon dioxide in the atmosphere than necessary. And this is part of what is responsible for global warming and has been a real concern for over 50 years. Okay, next we have the couple of videos on the greenhouse effect. If you wanted to learn more about that, you can click on that link. And then this is talking about, excuse me, coal. And coal is one of those fossil fuels that you can get from the United States and is responsible for a lot of pollution. It's responsible for producing energy. So you can go ahead and see how coal is formed by clicking on that link. All right, one more cycle to take a look at. That cycle is the nitrogen cycle. And the nitrogen cycle is driven by bacteria. So there is more nitrogen in our environment than oxygen or carbon dioxide. Most of our atmosphere is nitrogen. And the problem is that neither us nor plants can take in that nitrogen, which we need to make proteins and to build our DNA. We can't take that nitrogen in unless a bacteria does something with it and turns it into a usable form for us. And so we're going to talk about what those forms are. So the first kind of process that happens is called nitrogen fixation. And nitrogen fixation is where bacteria take nitrogen from the air and they turn it into a form that a plant can use. And so you can see that here in the image right here, right? So the bacteria that live in the nodules of this plant are actually in the legumes. So like peanuts, lots of different types of plants that are called legumes have special bacteria growing in their roots. And these bacteria take the nitrogen out of the air and they put it and turn it into a form that the plant can take up into its cells. Now there's also bacteria in the soil that will take the nitrogen out of the air and turn it into ammonia. But let's go back over to this nitrogen fixation. What's going to happen is we're going to go ahead and see that the plant will break down. And when the plant breaks down, or when an animal goes to the bathroom, they produce something called ammonia. And ammonia is a product of decomposition, or is the product that you give off. You, as humans, pee a form of ammonia called urea. And inside of that is a lot of ammonia that there are bacteria who love to eat that ammonia and break it down into something more usable. That's called ammonification. When the bacteria in the soil take the ammonia or the nitrogen and turn it into ammonia. Okay. And then what happens is this ammonia that's being produced by us or decomposers or by bacteria in the soil, they're going to then feed that ammonia, or another bacteria is going to eat that ammonia. When it eats that ammonia, it turns it into something called nitrite, NO2. Now, those nitrites then become a food for another kind of bacteria. And so we call that nitrification, when a bacteria takes nitrite and turns it into nitrate. That's called nitrification. And then these nitrates are then eaten by another bacteria, and then that bacteria is going to denitrify the nitrate. It's going to take all the oxygen out and turn it back into the N2 that we see in the atmosphere. Okay? So that is all then taken in. The nitrate can also be taken in by plants and animals and assimilated into our body so that we can use it for amino acids and for DNA. Okay, so that is where the cycle comes from. All right, that is the nitrogen cycle. So, new terms that we learned in the nitrogen cycle: nitrogen fixation. So that's the bacteria taking gas and turning it into ammonia or nitrate. Bacteria are the only organisms that can break the bond in nitrogen atoms. Okay. Now, nitrification is taking ammonia and turning it into a nitrite or a nitrate. Okay. Denitrification is taking the nitrite or the nitrate, mainly the nitrate, and turning it back into atmospheric nitrogen. And then ammonification is where bacteria and some decomposers, like mushrooms or fungi, are going to take the remains of organisms and turn it into ammonia. The last word we've learned is assimilation. That's where we take the nitrogen in the usable form, the ammonia, the nitrite, the nitrate, and we put it and assimilate it into our body so that we can use it for DNA or for proteins. All right, so there is a review video in the Google form, or excuse me, there is a review video in the Google Slides. So please feel free to watch that after listening to this, maybe on another day, or maybe you decide to use it for the take-home test. But it's there for you to watch. I hope this has been helpful, and I hope you have a nice afternoon.